Welcome to today's discussion of misinformation, hot topics, including elections and COVID and other emerging issues. We're delighted to have you with us here today. We are looking at a year that is following 2020, which was a very difficult and challenging year in misinformation. 2021 is proving to be just as challenging. And today with us, we have three experts in the field of mis and disinformation to help us unpack and understand some of what's going on with mis and disinformation, and to help us wrap our heads around what's coming next and where can we go in the battle against mis and disinformation. With me today, we have John Kelly, who is the founder and head of Graphika. We have Mark Schneider of the MITRE Corporation, where he is co-director of election integrity, and Isabella Camargo from the Stanford Internet Observatory. Thank you all for joining me. And without further ado, why don't we just jump right in, and I'll start by asking John, what did we learn about misinformation during the 2020 election cycle?
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, I'd say it's kind of a corollary of, with friends like these, who needs enemies? In other words, with kind of domestic sources of misinformation like we saw, who needs the foreign adversaries that we were worried about so much after the 2016 election cycle. And so that is sort of like the headline, that so much of what happened turned out to be domestic when we had been so worried about foreign stuff. Now, that's not to say that there weren't foreign attempts. I mean, at Graphika and with our partners, we tracked at least 12 foreign information operations that at least lobbed a couple of grenades in the direction of the 2020 election. But overwhelmingly, what we saw was kind of domestic in nature.
Thanks, John. Mark, what did you see? What happened with the Squint program and other ways that we were watching misinformation there?
Sure. So with Squint, which is the Social See Something, Say Something program, we enabled election officials and other groups and interested parties to be able to rapidly report misinformation and turn that around and get that useful, actionable information into the hands of the election officials. And what we saw was a variety of different things. We saw, claims getting distorted, where there would be a small incident where there was a few ballots that were misplaced. And that got conflated with examples of like a mail tray that was found. And all of a sudden there were lots of, mail trays and ballots lost all over the place. So you had this combination of not only the misinformation, but it getting mixed together and amplified, and new stories coming out of that. And I think that was something that, both was occurring with domestic people just innocently spreading misinformation, as well as, possibly foreign malign influence where they were amplifying those sorts of pieces of misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Isabella, at the Election Integrity Partnership out of Stanford, what were your learnings out of this election cycle?
Absolutely. I would reiterate a lot of what John pointed out in terms of the content, and Mark in terms of what was really needed in the space, some way to respond to the influx of disinformation that we were seeing. And really would double down on that point, that there's really a vacuum in this space for the systematic documentation and the ability to put narratives into context in a way that matches the pace at which these narratives are created. So that is something that we really focused on in the Election Integrity Partnership, and thinking about, what are the different facets to creating a way to get the research that so many people are doing in this space into a context where it can have impact in real time. So that's something that I was really interested in during the election. How do we track these narratives down quickly enough to actually respond to them? And one thing that made that really difficult on the content side is this idea of repeat offenders, which we highlight in our report. There was a very small handful of users that ended up creating a lot of the actual disinformation and this infrastructure that really exists to peddle these narratives. So those were, I think, two of my biggest takeaways from the election.
Thank you, Isabella. Last year, it seems to be walking with us into the next election cycle. We certainly need to be preparing and taking these lessons learned as we face 2022. But here we are in 2021, and what I'm seeing, and I want to ask you all about, is massive amounts of mis and disinformation on the COVID-19 situation. We're seeing things that are narrative in nature that persist over time. And we're also seeing things that pop up and then pop down. The latest thing that we're seeing in our program is this week, it's all about miscarriages that are resulting from the J&J vaccine. There's no data behind that, but that's the current allegations that we're seeing. And, looking around at all of you, I'm wondering, what do you think we can do about the coronavirus related misinformation? Is this a different challenge from elections? If so, how? How are we doing there? John, let's start with you.
I would offer just some kind of high level observations about how we've seen the space evolve around COVID. And then I believe, Isabella, you probably have some of the best intel on kind of what's happening on the ground with a lot of this stuff with the Virality Project and some of the new work there. But I'd say in broad strokes, what we've seen is that COVID provided a way for a lot of formerly separate conspiracy-oriented communities to begin swirling together and kind of sharing some of the same meta-narratives, framing, and talking points, and also some of the same kind of points of contact. So you might have had things, communities that before were very different, all kind of around conspiracies, but, you've got some that are around more health and medical-oriented conspiracies, the anti-vax community, which has existed for a long, in a long-standing way. You've got tech, sort of technophobic communities that believe that, electrical wires cause cancer and that 5G is going to, kill humans and animals and things like that. And then you've got other conspiracies that are more political in nature. So various stripes of political conspiracy. And COVID provided a way for all of these to start coming together and really starting to gel as kind of a unified conspiracy front, if you will. And that happened across countries. So even though kind of the early phases of COVID misinformation were really led by primarily kind of the European and American right wing, far right, they've been joined by all kinds of other folks that really don't share much of anything else with the far right, including kind of health and wellness oriented communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Isabella, I'd be interested in your thoughts on, are the narratives similar, around coronavirus? Are they similar here in the United States to what we might see in Canada or Belarus, or are we really a different kind of audience here in the US? Yeah.
So I think this has been something really, really interesting. For a bit of context, the Virality Project, which John mentioned, is the second iteration of what we were doing in the Election Integrity Partnership, now focused on vaccine disinformation response. Since a lot of the partners are the same, we did have this big open question of rehashing what's going to be in and out of scope for this new partnership. And whether we were going to focus only on US narratives, as we are focused on US partners in government and providing briefings to them, versus having a global context. That was something that we really went back and forth on, because, you can only track so much disinformation, but when it comes to the vaccine, this is really a global question, because someone dying in the UK is a story that is picked up by domestic anti-vaccine influencers to promote vaccine hesitancy in the US population. So this is a far more difficult problem, I'm finding, at least, than the election itself, because it is global in context. The actual stories are changing so quickly. With just this week, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine coming out as being halted in the United States. So, and I think the last thing here is, especially as disinformation researchers and people really focused on that space, it is even more difficult for us to actually try to parse out, what can we say with certainty here? You need even more knowledge on context on the actual situation. So we've really been kind of swimming through this and swimming through, how do you take a global context? How do you parse out all of these narratives that are kind of swapping back and forth very, very quickly? So it has been a big challenge, and we're still kind of working through how do we adapt here.
Thank you. Thank you, Bella. Mark, what are your thoughts on the similarities and differences in dealing with misinformation around elections and misinformation around a global pandemic?
Yeah, so that's a good question because with the election misinformation, you could easily sort of divide the misinformation into like targeted audiences or types of things where they're trying to divide communities, try to suppress turnout, things like that. With the COVID, what you don't have that, I guess, central topic of the election. So it can go off in lots of different directions. It can go off discussing blood clots or discussing miscarriages or whatnot. And it's, as John had mentioned, these all these disparate groups coming together to, combine their mis and disinformation. And that was something that we didn't see in the same way during the elections. During the elections, it was more about, going off to try to target either a group or a particular voting system vendor or something like that.
Yeah, really helpful observations there. Let's take a step back and start thinking about the bigger picture of misinformation. So far in our conversation, we've focused on last year's big problem space, and that's the elections. This year's big problem space, we're all focused on coronavirus. What about misinformation generally? John, I'm wondering what you think about how well are we doing on growing our capability as a nation and even globally in fighting misinformation, and where could we be stronger and what should we be doing differently here?
I'd say there's good news and bad news. I think the good news is that we're finding that, and there's good news on a number of fronts, that particularly the kinds of collaborations between different entities that we saw with the Election Integrity Partnership that we're very helpful with now around the Virality Project, where you have different institutions with kind of different sets of overlapping but complementary expertise that are learning how to come together and as a group fight this stuff. What are the procedures? What are the techniques? What are the processes? How do you kind of institutionalize that in initially kind of lightweight, innovative ways that we might be able to figure out a way to better institutionalize and support? I think that's all great news. I think the platforms have invested a great deal since 2016 in capabilities, or at least the platforms that can afford it, in capabilities to detect, particularly foreign state-sponsored and other kind of coordinated manipulation campaigns, where you have one actor, be it a foreign government or another entity, that is controlling multiple online assets in order to drive some kind of an information operation. I think that those moles are getting whacked a lot faster than they used to, and that's great news. At the same time, however, as we've just been discussing with the COVID infodemic and some of the things that are happening in kind of the aftermath of the election with what had been the political disinformation around the election, is that these things take on a life of their own, where the thing you're fighting is not, the Russians running a troll farm somewhere. It's actually most of the energy of that misinformation is legitimate, organic people that are wrapped up in it and believe it. And, that is a real problem that requires some kind of very intelligent, targeted solutions to help mitigate.
Yeah. Mark, if you had 5 minutes with some really influential policymakers, what kinds of things might you be recommending to them? How can we do this better?
So, I think something John picked up on, speed, and the ability also to take a step back and look at the larger influence campaign. So MITRE's developed a couple different technologies. One of them is called CLIO, or the Common Language for Influence Operations. Another one is SPICE, the Structured Process for Influence Campaign Evaluation. And using these tools along with some others, the ability to see how effective different responses are and to see how the campaigns unfold and how they can be disrupted, quickly and effectively.
Yeah, great points. Mark, you and I have had a number of conversations over the years about how to get that common language, that common framework that everybody could latch onto for combating the misinformation. I personally feel that's a very important priority. Bella, what do you think are some of the best things that we can do going forward to make ourselves stronger in this fight?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I agree with John in the idea that I'm really excited by the collaborations that are emerging in this space. I think it's so important to engage with researchers coming at this from all different angles, especially for the Virality Project. It's been super helpful to have some experts who have been looking at the vaccine misinformation space for a long time, because a lot of these narratives and tropes are being recycled from previous information operations in that space. So important to continue to engage, especially the academic front here. So I think that's something that I'm really hopeful of, and hopeful that we're getting better at those. The biggest thing, the Virality Project, that has been different than the election for me has been the lack of a centralized response situation. For the election, there was the EI-ISAC, which we were able to collaborate with in order to engage with election officials. However, for vaccine disinformation, it's really unclear who we're supposed to be engaging with to actually deliver the counter narratives. So we've assembled a coalition of stakeholders across public health, government, civil society, but that has been a really big pain point. And then when we actually get these stakeholders engaged, the biggest question that we're getting, which is actually very different, again, from the election context, is what do we do? What do we say? And when do we actually say something? So both the question of thresholds for actually issuing counter narratives, as well as how to best construct counter narratives, is something that we've seen everyone from the CDC to coalitions of doctors to public health officials and everyone in between asking us and basically saying, give us a green light and a message and we'll put it out. But that actual process is something that we weren't expecting because as researchers of disinformation, I think we're good at finding the disinformation and saying, how is it spreading? But when it comes to, okay, first of all, it's at the threshold that we actually need to respond. We can kind of answer that, and we're getting better at answering it. But then what to say and how to actually engage with people is something that we see as kind of outside of our scope right now, and that we're trying to understand how do we, who's best at doing that, and how do we engage with them?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Ken.
I mean, I would just add to that I think it's that kind of strategic communications response is a real, let's call it an opportunity that's waiting for some energy applied. So for instance, just as we detected the kind of confluence of these different varieties of conspiracy theories, you have to realize that information travels in really complex online networks, and communities sort of have ways of conditioning algorithms and relationships that sort of draw in the kind of content that's interesting to that community. And so there are lots of different audiences out there that you need to respond to. And each of them have their own preferred channels. Each of them have their own master narratives that you need to sort of show some appreciation for in the construction of your messaging. Some of those communities are probably lost causes, quite honestly, and other ones are persuadable. And being able to kind of tell those apart and know how to kind of target your response appropriately is a real challenge that has to be met.
At the risk of interjecting a little too much content for a moderator, I'm going to go ahead and share a little story. We've been involved right now. We've turned Squint's lens for crowdsourcing onto the COVID problem. And that's, it's pulling in all kinds of craziness. And one of the things that's really plagued us is that people in the crowd for Squint, it's a crowdsourced app, have been saying to us, I was getting all kinds of misinformation on this Facebook page or this other page that I belong to. And all of a sudden that has disappeared. And it says, on this page where I used to go, it says, if you want to join this conversation, come join me over at, and then it names some alternative platform and an alternative link. And those are platforms where people don't necessarily want to go to, right? It's not all platforms are created equal. But sometimes what we're seeing is that the information you need to be aware of is shifting locations quite a bit. So in addition to figuring out how to communicate the misinformation with the right stakeholders, we actually have to figure out where is the misinformation so that we actually can take that pulse. I want to, go ahead, John.
I say I completely appreciate your observation, and I think that again it ties into the point I was just trying to make, which is that there are different audiences with different response objectives in different places, and so some of those people are migrating to communities where they don't want to be counter-influenced, and they're trying to go there to avoid the counter-influence, and other folks are kind of being reached on mainstream platforms. Where there's a much better ability to kind of go and target them with better information. But what do you do when you have a kind of as we go, the kind of internet commons gets divided into more and more little subnetworks and micro platforms where people kind of self-segregate into them based on their kind of socio-political characteristics, and then how do you deal with that? And particularly some of these platforms don't have effective policies or even any policies that are trying to prevent this stuff. I mean, there are active identified Russian personas active on some of these platforms, and the platforms have said they're not even going to try and shut them down, and they're out there messaging right now.
Exactly. There's such a range of policies and procedures across the platform space. Mark, I wanted to turn to you on a question that comes up frequently, and it's what is the relationship between and the distinctions between misinformation and influence, and why does that matter, and how should we be thinking about that?
Sure. So misinformation is incorrect information. Some people conflate misinformation and disinformation, where one has intent and one may not have intent. But there's more than just telling lies or stretching the truth. Influence involves all sorts of different activities. It can be making sure a true story gets much more attention. So, for example, as we were talking about earlier with COVID and blood clots, playing up that story to create fear that you're going to have a negative health consequence occur because you got the vaccine is influence. It's not disinformation or misinformation, because it's true that a small number of people have gotten blood clots. It's also true that odds are you're going to have a more likely to get a blood clot from COVID than not. So by isolating a truth and sharing only that portion of it, you're creating influence. And influence ultimately is about changing cognitive behaviors. And eventually, if it's an effective influence campaign, results in people, being persuaded and motivated to go out and do stuff. In the case of vaccines, it's not get a vaccine, or in the case of elections, it may be to not vote or to vote differently. So, understanding that influence is much larger than just mis and disinformation is critical in order to be able to stop malign influence.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts from others about the difference in the role that influence plays as opposed to straight up misinformation?
Well, kind of my thought on that, is, as Mark was talking, is that you've got sort of two different things that are at stake in kind of the flow of information in 21st century online networks, right? One is the sort of the traditional American social scientific way of studying influence on, it's a very kind of psychology oriented approach, which is this information, you expose somebody, what's the effect of that? Is there a priming effect? Is there one of a multitude of other effects? Does it persuade somebody? Do they change their mind? What are the kind of cognitive effects of that communicative exposure? But what happens more and more in the 21st century than it did kind of in the age of broadcast is that these flows of information actually form communities that become the basis of the repetitive cycling of future information. And as Mark quite rightly pointed out, and is sometimes, is kind of known by propaganda researchers, I mean, the most effective propaganda is often just completely true stuff presented in a certain way, in a certain framing at a certain time. And so the formation of online networks and community structures where people come together, maybe, I was interested in yoga and you were interested in a certain strand of politics, but now here we are together adjacent to one another in network space, in the future receiving position of a lunch of common information in the future. It's sort of there's the impact of any particular message, which is kind of the micro level. And then there's the community formation that is, in a way, the longer term, more challenging issue.
Mm-hmm. So Bella, when we think about influence and the relationship of influence to narratives, what are your thoughts on that? Is it a way to detect influence when we're tracking narratives, or do we need something more?
Right. I think I would reiterate what John just said here. I think the idea that we have vehicles of influence already constructed on these platforms where very, very quickly information, whether true or not true, can be dispersed, and really with this veneer of authority. A lot of these users and communities use some platform features, such as being verified, having a lot of followers, getting a lot of retweets, all of these things, which can lead to this veneer of, okay, this information might be true, a lot of people agree here, et cetera. So thinking about, these are structures that already exist on the platforms. And so if we just think about, with a blind eye towards who is sharing this information, what kind of authority do they have in the communities that they're a part of, and how do those communities think about authority in the information space, without taking that into account when we're thinking about the narratives themselves, we won't really be able to deal with the narratives, right? And then going back again to the point of, these communities have pre-existing conditions that we need to take into account when we're thinking about actually debunking the narratives, right? Like, what is the overall foundation where this infrastructure was built on, right? What are the pre-existing beliefs in this community, who they trust and who they not trust? So when it comes to this idea of influence, that's really also what I think about, is kind of the entire ecosystem where this narrative is living and how that affects how the narrative is perceived.
Well, you all three are pointing at where we kind of need to go to grapple with some of these issues. And we're running out of time, but I want to ask each of you, what do you think are the goals with the next level of technology? What's just at the horizon of the possible or the impossible right now? Mark?
So I think, for a long time, the technology's been focused on trying to detect, mis and disinformation. But really where we need to be focused is trying to disrupt the flow of mis and disinformation, trying to break down the isolation of communities that form these sounding chambers, and being able to evaluate how well various different techniques work is key, and so having technologies that allow you to do that in real time or near real time is where we're on the cusp of, and where I think we need to go.
Mm-hmm. John, what do you think about the next set of technologies and goals?
Mm-hmm. Well, Isabella, forgive me. I'm going to mention something you and I were just talking about the other day, which, I think that there's a lot of fruitful work to be done at the intersection of what you guys at MITRE have been doing in terms of kind of detailing, figuring out how to kind of detail and specify some of this stuff, with the kind of stuff that Isabella's been learning, and sort of helping to teach me about what is they're seeing in the trenches in these kind of partnerships that are looking at just tons and tons of this stuff, which is around narratives and flow. And so, at Graphica, we've got fantastic technology for kind of understanding the structure of these online networks and how the information is flowing through it, and kind of where the foci of influence are for all these different communities. But there's so much data pouring through that network, and to sort of find automated ways or algorithmic ways of helping to build the discover the narratives and understand the relationships with them by analyzing that content, I think is really, really powerful. Because right now, we can enable a team of humans to kind of sit there and look at everything pouring through, QAnon cluster 2 and describe it, but they still have to read it all.
Right. So Bella, at the risk of knowing that John stole your thunder, I wonder what your thoughts are. If you could wave the magic wand, where would we be on the next set of technological capabilities in this space in 2 years?
Yeah. I mean, no. This is, I think, the crux of the issue here. And something that we haven't touched on as much is kind of this idea of the cross-platform nature of these narratives, right? And so it's something that's really, really human expensive right now, both to understand how narratives are coming up on different platforms, and also even on the same platform, understanding that two pieces of context, one which might be talking about miscarriages, one about infertility from the vaccine, are actually embedded in the same overall framing. And this is extremely human expensive right now. To give a bit of context, for the Election Integrity Partnership, we had the ability to hire 30 students, which created the bedrock of the actual partnership itself. And being from a computer science background myself, I immediately said, let's hire 30 computer science students. They know how to code, they know how to look at data, and it'll be great. Ended up being completely wrong there. We ended up hiring a mix of about 20 technical backgrounds and 10 non-technical backgrounds. And we found that the people who had that research ability, maybe from a political science background, international relations, anything in the social sciences, did far better, especially at the beginning. Everyone really got trained up, but at the beginning, they were able to pick up the skills a lot more quickly, because it's just sometimes isn't about what the numbers are saying or what the data is saying. And we can get there, right? But just pulling the data from CrowdTangle isn't going to get you to really understanding how are people looking at the different posts. How does this meme interact with this video on TikTok, interact with this tweet? And pulling all of that together is really expensive right now for a team of analysts. There's ways that we can amplify the work of these analysts, but it all comes down to unifying what's happening across different platforms, and also thinking about how do we really understand narratives in a more automated fashion.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think it's right that kind of sophistication of call it the non-technical analyst, the person who can sort of read the material that a community is exposed to with a kind of empathetic understanding of the way it's received in that community is so critical, particularly as we develop tools. I mean, at Graphica, we've done some interesting work on trying to look at how different types of classifiers for things like toxicity in conversations are not equally valid across different online communities. I mean, a sort of toxicity measure that might work really well on one type of community and identify sort of the more negative conversation will fail completely with a different group of people that it wasn't trained on. And to sort of believe in the creation of these tools that sort of one size fits all without any understanding of the individual kind of perspectives and values of the individual communities, you have to include that part.
Well, it is now time for us to start to wrap up, and I'd like to just go around and ask each of you for what are your closing thoughts and perspectives on the issues that we face in misinformation, and the best advice that you have for policymakers and big thinkers and technologists going forward. Mark, what are your final words of wisdom here tonight?
I think this is going to touch on something that both Isabella and John is we need a common language. We need to be able to share data independent of source and use it in a variety of different tools to perform the analysis, whether that's by computer scientists, social scientists, or anyone else.
John?
Well, I've sort of talked about what I think is the most exciting area in the technology side of it. I'd say that my kind of point I always like to make is that we get sort of really scared when we're trying to grapple with this space of things that we ought to be extremely respectful of, like the First Amendment and privacy. But we have to grapple with those real things in a way that still lets us get some traction on the problem. And I think that one of the key ways to do that is to be able to make a clear distinction between online speech as it's protected by the First Amendment, which as it ought to be, and those protections ought to be robust and err on the side of generous. But at the same time, the First Amendment doesn't protect criminal conspiracy. It doesn't protect fighting words. It doesn't protect yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. There are all kinds of things that the law is fairly well settled on that it doesn't cover. And yet we have a lot of things like manipulative troll farms that set up thousands of fake accounts, pretending to be real people that they are not, that are out there to manipulate real audiences, which is a type of fraud. And they're doing it for money. They're getting paid to do it, the people that do this, and that's commercial fraud. That ought to be something you go to jail for, not something you can actually, buy a beach house by running a political consultancy that does.
Yeah, totally agree. Bella?
For me, I think my biggest hope kind of moving forward is we're really realizing how important online conversations are to the safety of our critical infrastructure. And it shouldn't be the case that we are starting coalitions 100 days out of an election. We are still kind of running on fumes from that, and now doing the same thing for vaccine disinformation. These are huge, huge problems, which lead to large protests outside of polling sites and danger for people who run our actual elections, and distribution sites for vaccines becoming unsafe. So these online conversations really do have offline repercussions. And I think that I love what we do. I love the collaboration between academics and think tanks and companies like Graphica, but we shouldn't be running around kind of begging for money to fund this. And we should have a more sustainable way, especially for the people who protect us in this kind of critical infrastructure space, to understand these narratives and really keeping in mind First Amendment protections, but just to understand what's going on, so it's not such an uneven playing field.
Thank you, Bella. And thank you all. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bella, for an excellent discussion. I know we just touched the tip of the iceberg, but I'm now looking forward to our Q&A session.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.